this is Arunima and I'm with Rosie and Howard from the Liverpool Hope University. Today we'll be talking about our experiences as part of the education system of UK and India. Rosie and Howard here, they're both teachers and students, and we'll be looking for how being part of the education system across these countries might have some common ground, but also there might be some differences. So, Rosie, you've mentioned that you've worked with students of low income groups and students that are treated separately on the basis of how they perform academically. So, how do you think that sort of intersectionality between the income groups and their performances as students sort of play into this academic endeavor? So, how do you approach that?
So I think based on my experience, I work with students from low income backgrounds, and these students are generally like sort of separated from the students who perform better in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So I work with these students who have actually been taken away from the classroom and put like separately in like a smaller group system. So I might work with like 4 to 6 children. And yeah, they're sort of like struggling academically, and yeah, I think it's quite difficult because you want to be able to help them succeed academically, but also to get that you need to sort of build a really good relationship with them first of all, because the traditional setting of a classroom is not working for them and their behaviour is not being managed efficiently in the classroom. A lot of the time it can be from like a troubled home life, which can be obviously, it can affect other students in the classroom. So I think the point that the school is trying to make is that if they have more one-to-one time or 6-to-1 time, that it would benefit them. Yeah, I think I've also worked one-to-one with a child who comes from a low-income background, and the rest of the class generally just get on with the teacher and the teaching assistant. But for me, it's like I have to build a relationship with the student so that she actually will sit and do her work. So it can be quite challenging at times, and it seems like sometimes that the children from these disadvantaged backgrounds are sort of like pushed to the side a little.
So, how you deal with sports, and how do you approach how do you approach students that have a difficult time performing well in extracurriculars? Like, how do you plan that?
So when pre-planning the lessons, you've sort of got to think about the class, the sort of dynamics that work there, sort of behaviours with certain students. So that might look like organising the groups before, not letting the students themselves choose the groups. So if you put in lots of naughty kids together, that will probably cause you issues for the class. You won't be able to control the class, and then all the sort of learning objectives of the class won't be able to be met just because of the sort of dynamics that have led from that. So starting the class, you automatically sort of separate them. You sort of notice, sort of touching on what Rosie was saying there, you sort of notice quite quickly that although in England classes aren't really spoken about as often as what we've experienced here in India, you'll sort of notice that quite a lot of people from the similar backgrounds and similar sort of financial backgrounds sort of find social groups together. So it'd be quite common for those social groups to sort of instantly meet together, sort of notice each other's norms and get along well with each other. I think one thing that comes from that is, so with England we've got expectations in PE, so we were speaking earlier about expectations of PE kit. So when you buy PE kit at the start of the year, everyone's expected to have it, and if you don't have it, you've got sort of 2 weeks to sort of familiarise yourself with getting that kit. If you don't get that kit, you'll get detentions, which will lead to sort of behavioural issues later down the line. So if you sort of keep getting detentions, you're not going to be able to sort of get those experiences that those other classes might get. Yeah.
So would you agree that a lot of these behavior issues or this idea of deviancy is inherently rooted in the situational reasons that these kids might have? So what you said about this kid having a difficult time at home, which sort of reflects on her behavior with you in school, and then what you said about the idea of so much detention because of not being able to familiarize with the with getting access to the PE kit, it sort of trickles down into these students behaving a certain way. So is it like exclusive to the idea that a kid with facing difficult times at home or financially would have a difficult time coping, be it academically or in extracurriculars?
Do you want to start, shall
Yeah, I can think of a really good example actually. So one of the children that I work one-to-one with, her attendance generally is quite poor. I don't know about the what happens from that, like from the school's point of view, but I know that what she said to me is like she doesn't want to come into school. And I remember there was a school trip that was arranged, and it was supposed to be like going to another school to find out about STEM subjects and like STEM careers. And she was like, oh, I'm going to be off school on that day. And I was like trying to explain to her that it might be fun and it might be, you know, you might find out something new and important, or things like that. I was trying to encourage her to go because I just thought like if her attendance is so bad, like chances are she probably will be off that day, and then that closes this opportunity off from her. And that's just one example that I can think of right now, and just one child. So can you imagine like many children or many of these experiences being missed out? Also another thing is like, I know it's not, I think like when I was younger it was like subsidised, but for school trips sometimes parents have to pay extra. Obviously there are families that can afford it and families that cannot afford it, but regardless of the nature of the trip, whether it be some academic or whether it be for fun or whatever, a lot of the time children from low income families cannot afford it, so the children will miss out on that. And like I said, like they're missing out on learning opportunities or like networking opportunities. So yeah, I would agree with that statement.
Harvard, what about what happens with students that don't have access to sports facilities, coaching, and access to good exposure to exercise and nutrition? How does that affect the overall well-being, and how is that tied to the financial situation of the kids?
I've noticed personally from being a student that those that sort of do partake in regular exercise, regular sort of competing with the school and extracurricular activities, it sort of correlates with how well they perform academically. I think there is obviously a link there, possibly with the finances of the backgrounds and the opportunities that they do for sport. But I think with students, in terms of doing financially okay, they're able to partake in more sports. So I was fortunate enough to take part in sports like water polo, which is a very different sport from most schools, and that's purely on the basis that our school had a pool, which is very uncommon for a non-private school. So with that came issues. So lots of the schools that we were competing, in fact every school that we competed against was a private school. So I think with those different type of schoolings that we have in the UK, whether it be private or non-private, those that we have in the private are always guaranteed to have more educational opportunities, whether that be extracurricular, they have the more facilities, whereas those that are from the lower backgrounds, they don't have the time to commit to that. The parents might not have the transport to pick them up after schools, they won't necessarily use their own form of transport, it'll be public transport that they might be able to get to. So it's very, very difficult to sort of associate time.
So how would you deal with sports? And you mentioned how this idea of private and non-private schooling, it sort of has implications on how the overall demeanor or how the overall development of a child sort of projects itself. And that's not just limited to academics. So you were talking about how you were playing a sport that was, it was just had some degree of exclusivity, and it was like, there was a distinction if you did not have access to proper training, good coaches, and did not have the adequate resources, you might not even have the luxury to play that sport.
Yeah.
So could you go over similar instances as a teacher, how some students sort of may have a knack for a sport, may have an inclination towards the sport, but are not, however, able to pursue it because of a lack of resources.
Definitely, yeah.
other
So
reasons.
I've played in lots of teams at school, and then moving on to a teacher, you notice very quickly who's good at sports in the class. You know, who's got the natural gift, or who's willing to work on the skills and sort of build on that. Yeah, that's fine. So as a teacher and a student, I've noticed, and the teachers and myself have noticed straight away who's gifted at the sports, who's naturally gifted, and who's willing to work on improving. But there's only so far that you can take that whilst being in the normal school hours. So in the UK, I don't know if it's different here in India, but we've got government expectations to do 2 hours a fortnight of PE, so that's physical education. So there's only 2 hours in a fortnight that you're actually able to progress and develop those skills during school time. So lots of those extracurricular activities that do have sports teams, like a football team in our case, because that's very common, you'll have to do training after school. So for example, a student that might be from a lower financial background can't commit that time because they might only have one way of getting home, which is the school organised transport. So public transport for parents will be the only way of picking them up. So that time is just it's not feasible for them to come. They'll have to prioritise. The parents will have to prioritise cooking food and organising if they've got more than one child. However, sometimes because of the differences in ages, quite commonly it might overlap being primary and secondary. So they've got two places to be. So they just need one of the child that's in the secondary school to come home. So devoting that time to progress that skill and sort of become better at it as the sort of gift and talent are showing, it's really difficult to sort of improve that in a sense. Yeah.
That was Rosie, that was a great insight, because that sort of leads us back to this idea of how sociologists believe that merit, regardless of academic or extracurricular, merit is inherently tied to this idea of accessibility to cultural capital, and accessibility to cultural capital is inherently tied to this idea of the privilege of having access to resources, finances, and some degree of security and stability that allows students to prosper. And this leads us to this belief and idea that students that have had access and have had slightly advantageous positions in terms of the resources and the cards that they have been given, and the students that haven't been dealt with good cards or not have the access to good resources that might help them blossom in academics and extracurriculars, there's a huge difference in the level they might be. Even if they start at the same bottom line, someone might progress faster while some people might have a harder time. So this idea of merit is again inherently not something that is simply acquired, but it also ties back to what has been ascribed to you in terms of socio-cultural or economic situations. Moving on to our next point, we look at the education system. So for us in India, there's this idea, and this is a very prevalent theme, that there is this stigma around marks. So if you aren't performing academically as great as is expected of you, you are immediately sort of looked down upon, or you're treated differently than other kids that might not have as hard of a time keeping up their grades as you do. So is that this stigma around grades and this social difference in social behavior towards these kids also as prevalent in UK? And if so, have there been any policy interventions that might sort of help elevate this situation?
Do you want to go?
Definitely, yeah. So we've sort of just spoken on extracurricular activities there. So with schools in the UK, there's an expectation that they need to get a grade level of a 4, which used to be a C. So we've changed the grading systems now. So you need to get a 4 to proceed if you would like to go to college or sixth form, which is the next step after secondary school. You need to achieve these 4s. If you don't, you can still continue trying to achieve them whilst at college or sixth form, but it just overlaps with time. It's very difficult to sort of manage a lot of a lot of new subjects and new information at once, whilst continuing to do the maths and the English that they require you to do. So in terms of the extracurricular activities that kids are doing outside of school, they might not even be able to do them because the school wants them to prioritise the maths and English. It's so heavily focused on. That is the main focus, especially from children from low income families, where there's that natural correlation with them not achieving very well. But it can just be any student in general. The priority in schools is to make sure that every child comes out with the ability to do the maths and English, so they can have that access to careers later down the line. If they don't get them, the career opportunities later on in life is very limited because they don't think they're adequate in those areas.
Mm-hmm. Also, just adding on that point, in terms of academics, like because of the old grading system, there was like a bit of stigma, and it sort of like hindered you if you performed like poorly academically on like what you can choose later on in the school years. So when you're about 14 years old, you get to choose subjects that you'd like to study for the next 2 years. But if your academics up to that point, like 11 years old to 14 years old, if they're not good enough, then that affects what subjects you can do for the next 2 years. So for example, we were talking earlier about if you achieve poorly, then you are not allowed to take separate sciences, so biology, chemistry and physics. You have to take like the combined science route, which obviously closes doors on certain career paths and university courses. So yeah, it's yeah, I would agree.
That's interesting because in India we have a similar system where after your 10th we have a system of board exams where after your 10th grade you're expected to have a certain percentage that is a prerequisite to be able to choose the sciences for your higher education. And like you mentioned that a denial to these subjects limits your employability. However, there has been policy intervention, and like you mentioned, in your case there has been both social and structural changes.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, structurally there has been policy intervention through the new education policy of 2020, wherein they have not only just made the criteria of grades and percentage and marks less stringent, because your employability, what your interests are, these matter more than how much you scored. But also this idea of distinction in subjects, the sciences, the humanities and commerce, that has been sort of blurred, wherein you can take physics with say geography or home economics with maths. So there's no stringent distinction that you have to take the sciences or you have to take the humanities. So I think that has been a helpful structural initiative. However, much like all policies in India, the implementation and the expectations are vastly varied, and we would not dwell into that further. So you mentioned about this change in the grading system. Do you think there are positive implications of this? Apart from destigmatizing the idea of getting poor grades.
Yeah, so the new grading system offers a broader range of grades. So whereas before it was A to F, wasn't it? There's now 1 to 9. So there's a lot more opportunity to get a higher grade, and there's also a lot of opportunity to sort of, with the bottom range, to just squeeze over and sort of be able to pass on with your English and maths like we spoke before. The good thing about the grades now is that you can constantly improve. It's very rare to get a 9, whereas before you could achieve an A. You could achieve an A. It was very difficult, and the higher students would, but there's always room for improvement now. So whereas a 9 would be the equivalent of like an A++, so it's very rare that grade will be achieved, but it just allows students to constantly sort of look into the distance and think that's what I could achieve, so it doesn't sort of hold off on improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So we spoke about this domino effect of what you come from, in terms of your socio-economic background, and then what becomes of you inherently affecting your socio-economic future. So do you think that policy as well as political intervention in the education system might sort of manifest better results, better yield in terms of making individuals that are employable well-rounded, and have the ability to give back to society and not just limit themselves to what their original class or economic conditions are, because we speak on social mobility. So do you think policy intervention and political intervention can sort of enhance that social mobility?
I think it's allowing for a more range of jobs. In terms of social mobility, it's still very difficult because, as we mentioned before, the structure of the English education or the UK education, it's very sort of, you pose down this avenue depending on how well you've done. Even in sort of primary education, you'll do your SATs, and then you'll still be tested throughout school, and you'll be put down avenues where they think you're doing stuff. So BTECs have now come in, so BTECs like sports studies, or we spoke earlier on DT, which is design technology or food technology. There's a lot more option. So in terms of later careers after school, there's a lot more options for jobs. You can do things that you enjoy, more hands-on stuff, whereas before, if you'd have finished education and you've just got bad grades in common subjects like physics, chemistry and biology, if you've got bad grades, you're not really going to be able to sort of show off your academic ability, or even ability that you've got that's not necessarily from a classroom. You're not able to show that, but now people are able to choose subjects like sport, arts, these ones that we spoke about before. They can still prove themselves of good value, and they can still progress. Social mobility is still difficult to sort of get through and break down that wall, but now that they've got more option and able to prove themselves in other areas, it's a lot better for the opportunity to be socially mobile.
Definitely, that was a very wonderful insight. I would be going over certain practices, the scenarios that play out in India, and I would love to hear your take on if these things were to manifest in the UK education system, and like how would that play out? What implications would it have? So first off, like we discussed, that there is this common ground wherein students are limited to what subjects they can choose based on the marks they get. There's also this idea of private education being better than public education, and these private educational institutions, they have this idea of donations and fundings. So the amount of money you throw, the more chances you have in getting admission. So aside from the existing admission fee, there's also this idea of donations, that sort of the highest bidder gets to go. So do you think something like that, if it happens in UK, and if it were to happen in UK, do you think it will sort of create a wider variation in what the students are turning out to be?
So I think quite a common perception of private education is that they do better. It's not necessarily the fact that they will do better. I think because there probably is small percentages that lean towards them doing better, but I think they've just got better access to facilities. The teachers are probably better educated. All those factors come into it. But I think the main thing is the sort of connections that they're able to make. The fact that they're able to meet people on a more regular basis because of funding. They're able to sort of buy visits from people that might be in these sort of opportunities that are up, earning high amounts of money. Whereas if it's just a public school, the people that they're able to bring in are very limited. It might just be sort of by association of teachers necessarily, rather than by association of the school. The school's got such a high standing in a private education field that it'll bring attraction, whereas a public school won't, because there is so many. So I think on top of the facilities and the ability to do a lot more, just in that sense, I think the main thing comes from the opportunities that come after school. It's that sort of separates them between the public schools.
So do you agree, do you disagree with this idea of there being the need for private education and the endless amount of fortune it generates? Like this, it's basically an industry at this point. So do you think it has any merit?
I think from a balance perspective, it's very difficult to say yes, but I think if you're in the higher financial situation, you'd say definitely we want private education, because it'll be able to sort of keep the social mobility the way that it is. If you've got lots of money, you'll keep on having lots of money, your children will have good jobs, it'll continue, that'll sort of just keep going. Whereas if we keep the public schools will want to sort of want the elimination of private schools, they'll want the fairness, they'll want the sort of same facilities, fair opportunities for all children, but it's the people with the power probably won't want that as well. So Rosie might want to add something, I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to just say what you basically just said, like people from higher income backgrounds will probably be in favour of that, because it means better opportunities for their child. But
And they get to stay at top, and they get to stay
yeah,
at power.
Yeah.
definitely, yeah. But I think those from low income families will be horrified if that was to be the case.
But even objectively, I think there is no point in there being this idea of education being private and only a very specific group of people being able to afford this very exclusive type of education that gets you access to networks and resources that you might not get in a subsidized educational institution. So another thing that is in the case of India is this idea of patronage and this idea of, and I hate to throw this word around, but nepotism in educational institutions, higher educational institutions, that if you have a big brother looking over you, if you have a father and uncle, and to be more inclusive, if you have a relative, a mother, an aunt who has access, who has the money to throw around, your merit lays in that connection more than it does in what you've scored, what your credentials are. So is this something that happens in the UK too, that people get a backdoor entry to institutions just because they have a big brother connection?
I personally don't have any experience regarding that because I come from a low income background and I went to a public school, so I don't really know that many people who have been in that situation. I don't know if you have.
I think it's a very different to how you've described. So I think in terms of getting someone in, I think that's still very much there. So if a father has a son and he's part of a business, I think getting the son into the business is still relatively easy, despite what other candidates might offer on an interview or CV or something like that. But I think in terms of progression, they've still got to prove themselves as a valuable part of a company or anything like that. I think you've still got to prove your worth. I think at the very, very top, so if someone owned a business, getting someone in and sort of handing that over is still pretty easy to do. But I think at the sort of common level, in terms of your father's part of a school board or something, getting into the school will be fine, but he wouldn't just be able to sort of go, yes, he's going to pass with X, Y, Z in terms of grades. You'd still have to prove yourself and sort of own what you've got.
What I was trying to get at was this idea of people networking their way into higher educational spaces. So like you have these private universities where they have this diversity reservation, and then there's some seats that are for, say, students that are doing a study abroad situation. So similar to that, in India, there's this idea that if you have enough money, if you throw enough money at it, you can just buy a seat into a well-off university. So is that something that happens in the UK as well, wherein people are buying seats, entrances into university?
I would lean towards the answer of no. I
Okay.
think the government provide a lot of money for students to go to university, so it's quite common now for students to go to university and study what they want to study. I think in terms of the very high paying degrees, in terms of after their career what they're going to go into, it'll be more strict, but lots of students have the opportunity, and secondary education are really pushed to sort of promote the university life and the university sort of degree that you can go into. So I think in that sense I'd have to lean towards no.
Okay. Another thing that is in the case of India is this idea of political intervention, which is we've witnessed time and again that if a political party was in power, it'll try to sort of tweak its way around the curriculum, what's being taught, at what level is it being taught, and sort of the general consensus is that it is to push forward a certain agenda, push forward a certain propaganda, while at the same time it is to rewrite the history, rewrite with what's being taught to the students in India. Because the case of India is unique because we have we faced oppression, we faced colonization, and our history is what we've been retold by the victors. So this idea of political intervention, the intervention of political parties, the leaders into deciding what is being taught, so as to put forth this vision of the country, this idea of the nation. Do you think something like that could work in the UK, wherein the history books, or the what is being taught in the history books is either eliminated entirely or tweaked in a way to push forward a certain idea?
So it's actually really interesting because I experienced this only a couple of years ago, and it was actually, I was studying abroad at the time. I was studying in the US, and I remember like having conversations with people I met there who were Americans, and they were telling me about like British colonization, and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, why are you telling me this? And then they basically explained the whole thing to me, and I remember like when I was younger we learned a little bit of like the Atlantic slave trade, but like in the curriculum in primary and secondary school, I don't know how it is if you choose history aged 14 to 16. I don't know if you learnt it there because I chose geography, so the other humanity, but up until the point of it being like compulsory education, they don't teach about British colonisation, at least not in my school, and I went to a state school that was obviously free, and yeah, I do not remember getting taught anything about that. So I think, yeah, it's definitely pushing a narrative there, and sort of keeping that away from like sort of general knowledge.
Yeah, we're very much taught about the wars where England and the UK have been successful, and the partnerships that we've made, and all the positives. There's a very large amount that's hidden from us at a young age that we're not taught about, unless we had a massive interest, like Rosie was saying, age 14 to 16. Unless you take it afterwards. I also didn't do history, but there's more exposure to a broader range of knowledge, whereas before, when you didn't choose it, you sort of shown England this, England that, all in a positive light. So yes.
Okay, just an additional point to this. There's often this system of eliminating textbooks that the government thinks is too radical or is too critical of a regime, of an institution, of a paradigm. So in the case of India, there's literature that is being eliminated completely because the younger minds are not fit to be radicalized as of yet. So is that something that happens in the UK too? Like they'll eliminate books like How to Kill a Mockingbird, or George Orwell's 1984, or
no, there's none of that. I think if we want access to those resources, we can go to free public libraries, and we will find, like, To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. We actually do read that in the curriculum in secondary school. But yeah, like other books on like extreme topics, I think, are still widely available. So it is there for us to like seek out if we want. But again, if you're not heavily interested in literature or history or things like that, then you're not going to really come across it.
And what do you think are the implications of eliminating such texts and limiting this idea of free thinking and free thought and criticality within students? Like, do you think students need to be radicalized? Do you think students need to be critical?
I think one thing that I'm aware of at the moment is I learnt a book called Of Mice and Men, and that's recently been taken out of schools in Wales.
Okay.
So the reason being is because of its sort of racist words that it's used in the books. So I think obviously we don't promote racism, but it does need to be taught. People need to be taught awareness of that. So I think limiting access to these books where you can be exposed to it. I think there's obviously a correct way of dealing with books like that in class, but losing awareness is a negative thing for children in the UK. Yeah.
So Rosie and Howard, I very I am very grateful for the lovely insights that you've provided, and I can see like a lot of it puts things into perspective that what differences we have had culturally in terms of education, in terms of how just the social environment is in, say, a school in UK and a school in India. And also it was interesting to go over how history or literature is being taught to you and how the UK approaches these ideas as opposed to India. So I'm very grateful for your contribution to this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.